I don't remember the exact sentence I was explaining. I only remember the feeling that crept in while I was still talking. It arrived quietly, without warning, settling somewhere between my chest and my throat. I was choosing my words carefully, trying not to sound emotional, trying not to seem dramatic, trying not to ask for too much. And suddenly I realized I was no longer explaining something important. I was justifying my own existence in the conversation. There was no raised voice, no argument, no cruelty in the obvious sense. Just his silence on the other side, polite, distant, unmoved. The kind of silence that listens without receiving. I kept talking because stopping felt worse. Stopping would mean admitting that what I was saying no longer mattered. So I continued, even as something inside me began to shrink. I noticed it in small details first. How I started softening my sentences before he even reacted. How I added disclaimers that no one asked for. How I smiled slightly while speaking, as if that could make my words easier to accept. I wasn't trying to convince him anymore. I was trying to make myself smaller, easier, lighter, less demanding. Explaining stopped being communication. It became survival. The humiliation wasn't loud. It didn't burn. It didn't explode. It was quiet, almost polite. It sat with me while I nodded, while I waited, while I pretended this was still a conversation between two people. I felt it when I realized I was explaining things he never had to explain to me. Feelings, absences, needs, things that should have been obvious if I mattered the same way. That was the moment something shifted. Not between us, but inside me. I understood that explaining, in that space, was no longer an act of love or clarity. It was a slow erosion of dignity. I was still speaking, but I wasn't being met. And for the first time, I wondered how long I had been mistaking silence for patience and humiliation for effort. At first, I told myself this was normal, that explaining was just part of being patient, part of being mature, part of loving someone who didn't express things the same way I did. I said it quietly, almost kindly, inside my own head. Not everyone communicates the same, I thought. Not everyone notices things immediately. So I adjusted. I slowed down. I chose softer words. I learned how to explain without sounding like I was asking for anything at all. It became a habit so subtle that I didn't question it. Explaining blended into everyday moments. Small conversations, pauses that lingered too long, looks that didn't quite arrive. I explained why I was tired, why something mattered to me, why silence felt heavy sometimes. I framed my feelings carefully, as if they were fragile objects that might break if handled too directly. And every time he listened without really listening, I told myself that being understood took time. I didn't feel angry. I didn't feel wronged. That's what made it harder to notice. There was no clear moment where I could say, this is where it crossed a line. There was only the slow erosion of certainty, the quiet question of whether my needs were too much, my timing inconvenient, my expectations unreasonable. Explaining started to feel like proof. Proof that what I felt needed validation. Proof that I couldn't simply be felt without being translated. I became very good at it, at anticipating confusion, at clarifying emotions before they were even misunderstood, at smoothing the edges of my own reactions so they would land gently. I explained calmly. I explained thoughtfully. I explained as if doing so would protect the connection from discomfort. But somewhere along the way, explaining stopped being about connection. It became a way to prevent distance, even as distance quietly settled in. What I didn't realize then was how much explaining was costing me. Not in energy, but in presence. Each explanation pulled me a little further away from myself. Each careful sentence taught me to pause before feeling fully. I thought I was preserving peace. I thought I was being considerate. But beneath all that effort was a growing sense that something essential was being exchanged. My dignity, slowly and silently, for the hope of being understood. It didn't happen all at once. There was no argument that marked the beginning of the distance, no sharp sentence I could point to and say, "This is where it changed." Instead, it arrived quietly, woven into ordinary moments. Conversations that ended a little sooner than they used to. Questions that were answered but not explored. A presence that felt technically there, yet emotionally out of reach. I kept explaining because it seemed easier than naming what I was starting to feel. I explained my moods before he asked about them. I explained my silences so they wouldn't be misinterpreted. I explained why something that seemed small to him felt heavy to me. And every time I did, I waited. Not for agreement, but for recognition. A sign that my words had landed somewhere meaningful. Most of the time, what I received was neutrality. Not rejection. Just a calm, distant acknowledgement that left everything unchanged. The strange part was how quickly I learned to accept that neutrality. I told myself it was better than conflict, better than tension, better than making things uncomfortable. Explaining became my way of keeping the surface smooth, even as something underneath began to thin. I started measuring my words, editing my emotions mid-thought, choosing clarity over honesty, because honesty felt like too much risk. Sometimes I would hear myself speaking and feel oddly detached, as if I were narrating my own inner life from the outside. I noticed how carefully I constructed sentences, how I left space for misunderstanding just so I wouldn't seem demanding. I wasn't asking to be met anymore. I was asking not to be dismissed. And that difference mattered more than I wanted to admit. There were moments when I almost stopped explaining. Moments when the words hovered at the edge of my mouth and I felt the urge to stay quiet instead. But silence felt dangerous then. Silence felt like abandonment of the connection, of the effort, of the role I had assigned myself. So I spoke. Again. And again. I began to notice a quiet imbalance forming. He could exist without translating himself. His moods were accepted as they were. His distance required no explanation. Mine, on the other hand, came with footnotes, context, justification. I didn't resent him for it, not consciously. I resented the part of myself that kept adapting without asking why. Explaining slowly replaced something else. Listening, presence, mutual curiosity. Instead of wondering how we both felt, I focused on making sure he understood how I felt. As if understanding were the same as caring. As if clarity could substitute connection. As if being articulate could protect me from feeling unseen. There was a quiet loneliness in that realization. Not the kind that comes from being alone, but the kind that settles in when you are consistently misunderstood in subtle ways. I was sharing more, yet feeling less known. Speaking often, yet feeling unheard. Explaining everything, yet being met by very little. Still, I stayed. Not because I didn't notice the cost, but because naming it felt heavier than carrying it. Explaining had become familiar. Familiar things feel safer, even when they quietly diminish you. And at that point, I wasn't ready to ask what it would mean to stop. At some point, explaining stopped feeling voluntary. It felt automatic, almost reflexive, as if my body had learned to fill the silence before my mind could question it. A pause would appear, and I would rush to soften it. A misunderstanding might surface, and I would hurry to clarify it. I didn't wait to be asked anymore. I preemptively explained, as if doing so could prevent disappointment before it had a chance to exist. What made it difficult to recognize was that nothing was overtly wrong. There was no cruelty to resist, no neglect obvious enough to justify pulling away. Everything looked calm on the surface, functional, acceptable. And yet, every explanation carried a subtle message I never intended to send. That my feelings required approval to be valid, that my presence needed context to be tolerated. I began noticing how the explaining always moved in one direction. When he was quiet, it was simply how he was. When I was quiet, it needed interpretation. I explained my tone. I explained my timing. I explained why something mattered now and not later. Without realizing it, I was teaching myself that being understood was a prerequisite for being allowed to feel. There were moments when I tested the silence. Not consciously, not dramatically. Just small pauses where I didn't immediately fill the space. Those moments felt unbearably loud to me. I would sit with them, heart slightly tense, waiting to see if he would step forward on his own. Most of the time, nothing happened. And in that nothing, I felt an unfamiliar ache, not rejection, but absence. I told myself I was overthinking, that not every silence needed meaning, that expecting reciprocity was unrealistic. Explaining returned quickly after those moments, almost apologetically, as if to compensate for the discomfort of having waited. I reassured him. I reassured the space between us. I reassured myself, even as something inside me began to resist. The resistance wasn't loud either. It didn't demand change. It didn't issue ultimatums. It showed up quietly, as a growing fatigue, a subtle heaviness that made each explanation feel slightly harder than the last. I noticed it when I paused before speaking, calculating whether what I was about to say was worth the effort of translating it. Explaining had once felt like care. Now it felt like performance. I was choosing words not to express myself, but to avoid misinterpretation, to minimize impact, to remain agreeable. And in doing so, I felt myself drifting further away from the raw truth of what I felt, as if proximity to my own emotions required permission. I started wondering when the balance had shifted so quietly, when communication turned into negotiation, when clarity became a substitute for closeness. I wasn't asking for much, or at least that's what I kept telling myself. But the fact that I needed to explain that too was beginning to feel like a warning. Still, I stayed in the familiar rhythm, explaining, adjusting, softening. Not because it felt good, but because stopping felt like stepping into uncertainty. And uncertainty felt more frightening than the quiet erosion I had grown used to carrying. Yet beneath all that effort, something was slowly changing. Not in the space between us, but in my willingness to keep paying the same price. I hadn't stopped explaining yet. But for the first time, I was beginning to notice how much of myself disappeared every time I did. I began to notice how explaining followed a predictable pattern. First, there was the feeling, immediate, unfiltered, real. Then came the pause, where I assessed whether that feeling was acceptable to bring into the space between us. Only after that did the words arrive, carefully shaped to sound reasonable, calm, non-threatening. By the time I spoke, what I shared was no longer the feeling itself, but a diluted version designed to be received without friction. There was a strange exhaustion in that process. Not the kind that comes from talking too much, but the kind that comes from constantly translating yourself. I felt it in the way my thoughts slowed before conversations, in the way I rehearsed explanations internally, anticipating questions that might never be asked. I wasn't preparing to connect anymore. I was preparing to defend the validity of my inner world. Sometimes I caught myself explaining things that didn't need explaining at all. Why I needed space. Why something hurt. Why silence affected me differently than it affected him. Each explanation felt like a small concession, an unspoken agreement that my experience alone was insufficient, that it needed context to earn its place. What unsettled me most was how normal it all began to feel. Explaining became woven into my sense of responsibility. If something felt off, I assumed it was my job to clarify it. If there was distance, I assumed I needed to bridge it with words. I rarely considered the possibility that some distances exist because both people aren't stepping forward in the same way. There were moments when I wondered what would happen if I simply stopped. Not dramatically, not angrily, Just quietly, if I let a feeling exist without translating it. The idea made my chest tighten. Not because I feared losing him, but because I feared what his response, or lack of one, might reveal. Explaining had become a form of control. As long as I explained, I could believe the situation was manageable. That misunderstanding was temporary. That effort would eventually be met with effort. Silence, on the other hand, offered no such reassurance. Silence had the power to expose imbalance without commentary. I started noticing how my explanations often ended the same way, with me softening my own point, adding phrases that minimized what I had just shared. It's not a big deal. I might be overthinking. I just wanted to explain. Those words weren't meant for him. They were meant to make my presence easier to carry. There was a quiet grief in realizing that. Not because I had been misunderstood, but because I had participated in my own erasure. Explaining hadn't only shaped how he saw me. It had shaped how I saw myself, as someone whose feelings required justification to be allowed. I wasn't angry yet. I wasn't ready to confront anything. But something had shifted beneath the surface, a subtle awareness that the cost of explaining was no longer abstract. It was personal, and it was accumulating. For the first time, I questioned whether explaining was actually keeping the connection alive, or simply delaying an answer I wasn't ready to hear. Whether clarity was truly the bridge I thought it was, or just a way of avoiding the discomfort of seeing things as they were. I didn't stop explaining that day, but the habit had lost its innocence. What once felt like patience now felt like quiet self-betrayal. And in that realization, I sensed that something was approaching its limit, even if I didn't yet know what I would do when I reached it. I didn't stop explaining because I suddenly understood everything. There was no moment of clarity that fixed the imbalance or made the silence easier to read. What changed was smaller, quieter, and far more decisive. I began to notice the moment right before I explained. The breath I took. The instinct to soften myself. The urge to make my feelings easier to carry. And in that pause, I felt something I hadn't allowed myself to feel before. Respect for my own inner weight. Not anger. Not distance. Just the understanding that dignity doesn't announce itself. It withdraws gently when it's no longer welcome. I don't know what happens when you stop explaining. Not completely. Not in every situation. But I know what happens when you keep explaining past the point of being met. Something inside you begins to believe that your presence alone isn't enough. That belief doesn't arrive loudly. It settles slowly, like background noise you only notice once the room goes quiet. And sometimes, choosing not to explain isn't about withholding words. It's about allowing the silence to tell you what effort has been hiding. If you're listening to this and something in you feels exposed, I want you to know how deeply that matters. Thank you for staying with this story. Thank you for listening without rushing to fix it. Some stories aren't meant to be solved, only recognized. And if this one felt familiar, maybe it's because you too have learned what it costs to keep explaining yourself in spaces that no longer lean toward you. There are more stories like this. Quiet ones, honest ones. Stories that don't ask you to change, only to notice. I'll be here for the next one.